For this video, we are going to create a bezel set stone, and for my design, I have chosen a brooch, which is going to have a pin on it, but your design is totally up to you. I'm also going to utilize skills that we have talked about in other videos, but the first thing I want to show you is that I have made my metal pieces out of watercolor paper first. So the expectation after you create your sketchbook design is that you're going to cut out the various pieces of metal that you need and label them so that you can figure out how big they need to be, what dimensions they need to be, how they sit together, and it's just an easy way to make mistakes before you get to your final pieces of metal. So as you can see, I have two pieces of metal I'm going to rivet together for my brooch, and then a bottom piece of metal that I'm going to call word plate that I want to use some letter stamps on and hang with some jump rings. And then the last piece of metal I will need is for my bezel, which is going to hold my stone in place. So I'm doing all my preliminary measuring and planning with the watercolor paper first. So to make your bezel, you first want to measure your stone. So I like to trace my stone onto my watercolor design first. And then I take a scrap sheet of the watercolor paper that's like a long rectangle, and I wrap it as tightly as I can around my stone. And I want the two edges of my watercolor paper to meet perfectly. This is going to be the measurement for my metal, and I want no gaps because we are eventually going to solder these things permanently together. The height of the bezel, the width, needs to sit just a little bit above the stone, but the highest portion of the stone still needs to be visible in order to add to the piece. Otherwise, your bezel will just cover up your entire stone. So this is the proper height for me and the proper length. So now I'm going to take some metal, and I wanted to do an etching, so I did that first. That is optional for you. But this is going to be my back plate according to my design. And I'm going to take my watercolor paper that I measured earlier and just draw with Sharpie on top of that plate. So then I will cut that out with a jeweler's saw after this. And I'm not going to show you that as part of this video, but I want to show you how I do plan using the watercolor paper. I'm going to do the same thing with the brass sheet that I'm going to rivet on top of the copper. And I'm trying to utilize the metal that I have. So you don't want to just slap your design in the middle of a piece of metal. You want to be able to save as much metal or utilize as much metal as possible. So the bezel that we're going to be using is either copper sheeting like this or brass sheeting. So I have chosen brass because I want it to be the same as the top plate, but you could choose copper as well. The nice part about the brass is that it works perfectly with the stone that I've chosen. So I don't have to do a lot of editing and filing and cutting that metal. I just have to measure the right length. So again, I have measured out all my pieces that I'm going to cut, and then I've cut them out, saving you some time in this video. So everything should match your watercolor designs, and then when you lay your metal together, it should be the vision that you've had in your sketchbook. For mine, I again am riveting, so that's a skill that we learned in the past. Again, you don't have to do this, but I wanted my brooch to have some more advanced and higher expectations for you. So I am measuring where those drill holes for my rivets are going to go for my cold connection. So this piece is going to have a cold connection as well as a hot connection with soldering the bezel. So I've drilled those holes first, and I want my stone or my cabochon to be on top of this brass piece. So I need to take the bezel that is going to fit around my stone, and I want to shape it so that it fits. So those two ends, like I did with the paper, meet with metal. It's a little bit trickier because obviously the metal is harder to manipulate than the paper itself. But I want to make double, triple check that this is the right size. My stone doesn't slip out. Everything is nice and flat. It's the right width and the right length because we are going to solder it. If it is not, then I can file it. I can cut it a little bit more just to make sure that all those ends are as perfect as possible. Because if you don't have them perfect, your soldering is going to be messed up. So the first thing I want to do is I don't really necessarily need to worry about the shape of the stone. I just want to make sure that it measures tight around the stone and that those gaps are not present with the two ends of the metal. So it does get a little finicky. The stone's a little slippery, and your fingers may hurt just trying to push it and measure it to make sure that everything fits correctly. But it is worth it to double and triple check. You also see the height. I can see the top of my stone. The bezel is going to be pressed up against that stone at the end after we solder it. So I want just enough that it's going to hug that stone against the metal, but again, not cover up its beautiful design. So soldering this is going to be relatively easy compared to sweat soldering, but you want to make sure that everything goes correctly, otherwise it could affect your overall design. So I'm going to go over to my soldering station, and for this we are going to use the third hand, and I like to put it on top of the tripod just so it is eye level. I want the seam of my bezel to be the lowest point. And I also want to make sure that everything is even. So it's the lowest point and it's even. You don't want it to be at a slant, only because your solder will flow down that slant. And you want it to sit perfectly in that seam. So I'm going to take some flux, paint it right on the seam, and I'm only going to use one piece of hard solder. And we're using hard solder so that it doesn't separate, because we are going to do a lot of manipulating to this metal. So I'm taking my tweezers, getting one piece of hard solder, and I always put the bowl underneath my metal just in case I drop it, but it is a little tricky to get that one piece of solder directly on the seam. So now I'm going to be using either a medium or a small torch, so a 180-00 or 180-0. For this particular piece, I am using a 180-0, which is the medium, because I know that my metal can withstand it. But sometimes if your metal is a little bit thin, it can get too hot and it can melt. So I'm going from the top first, just trying to get that flux nice and white and sticky so that my solder doesn't fly out. And remember, you have a little bit of time to move that piece of solder if it does jump out of the way. You want that solder, again, to be right on the seam. So once the flux gets crusty and that solder stops jumping, you can go closer with your flame, constantly moving it, trying to just melt that piece of solder directly on the seam. And you'll see the silver sort of sit inside of the crease. And once it turns red hot and it turns silver, then you need to stop, because again, you could melt your metal if it's too thin. So I take the whole third hand and I like to dunk it in the water and then double check to make sure that it's not super hot. And then I check my seam, give it a little pull, give it a little tug, make sure that everything is set. And because it's brass, this is going to go into the super pickle. So I have cleaned up my metal. The solder worked. The seam is good. And now I can go back to my cabochon just to make sure that everything sits right. Sometimes it doesn't solder correctly and things can be off balance, but you want your bezel to fit, again, neatly and snugly around your stone, so it's not going to fall out. If it is off balance or you do need to file it, you want to make sure that you're filing it after this stage, because once you put it onto the back piece, it's harder to do that because you could scratch up your back piece or you could dent your bezel, and that's no good. So I'm just filing off a little bit of extra solder on the outside. If you have solder on the inside of your bezel, it's not generally a problem because you won't see it. However, if it has a lot of texture and it's lumpy, it could affect how your stone sits in your bezel. So if it's flat, don't really worry about it. If it's lumpy, make sure that you file it or flex shaft it off. So now I have my flat piece that I've sanded and cleaned it up because we are going to solder the bezel to that piece. And I want to make sure that I do this before I rivet, only because I don't have to go through two pieces of metal. I'm also taking a wooden mallet just to make sure that there are no gaps between my bezel and my back piece of brass. Sometimes it is uneven and you might need to file it if there's like a little chunk of metal sticking out, or there's just one part that's just not sitting flat. And I like to just make sure that my stone fits in there, because once you solder this to the back piece, it's not going to be easily manipulated. So it needs to be the shape of your cabochon now. So not a lot of bending, not a lot of manipulating. So now I'm going to take it over to the soldering station, and we are going to use the tripod once more, and I'm going to heat it up from the bottom. And you want to make sure that it sits on the tripod nice and flat. So if the tripod's at an angle, adjust it just a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to take flux again, and I'm going to paint the back piece where my bezel is going to be soldered. And remember, I only need a little bit of flux. And then I want to sit my piece where I want it. So in this part, it's really important not to bump it, not to move it, because once you solder it, it's going to be harder to fix if it's not soldered correctly. So I'm going to be using medium solder for this part. You can use hard or easy, but I like to make sure that my bezel is not going to come off and there are no gaps, so I'm using medium solder. And the most important part of this is that you want to spread out your solder on the inside of the bezel as it touches the back piece. So I'm using probably about 6 pieces of this small solder. And I'm being pretty generous. Again, you can always add more solder if you feel like you need to, if there are gaps. It is harder to remove excess solder. So I'm leaving little gaps in between each piece of solder because remember it's going to spread out and fill those spaces. But I am trying to get it as close to where the bezel meets the back piece. Nothing really in the middle, only because I don't want my stone to be affected on how it sits on the back of the metal. So this does take a little bit of time and a little bit of patience. Once you have it where you want it, you are able to take your torch, and for this I'm going to be using a medium torch, so 180-0, and I'm going to go from the bottom like we were doing with sweat soldering. Okay, so this part is extra tricky because the solder likes to jump, obviously, and there are more pieces for you to watch. So every once in a while, you take your tweezers, sort of move those pieces as they jump. Some people like to heat up the flux first and then add their pieces of solder, but it is entirely up to you and what technique you like. I really have no patience and I like to just solder and get these things done right away, so I do not heat up the flux beforehand. So just adjusting every once in a while, letting the flux get a little bit more white and crusty in each part. Standing up a bit just to make sure that my bezel hasn't moved too much from its original spot, because that is possible. Heating it up from the bottom again, watching my flux and my pieces calm down. And after they calm down, then I am able to get closer with that blue cone tip. So you see that the flux is getting white and crusty, and soon it will have some fire scale on it. And the best part about soldering this bezel is when the seam flows. So you can see my back piece is getting red hot, that flux is going away, constantly moving my heat around and around that seam. And I'm watching very closely as my solder turns to silver. So I take another tweezers just to give it a little push down to make sure that that seam flows all the way through. You want every part of your bezel to be attached. You don't want gaps in between where there's no solder. So it is red hot. I have annealed it, and my seam has flowed perfectly. And now I need to quench it because obviously it's extremely hot. But I like to double check my bezel just to make sure nothing is loose, everything is on there, and I don't have to resolder. I will have to clean up some of the excess solder, but I will wait after I pickle that and use the flex shaft. Alright, so I've cleaned it up. I haven't used the flex shaft yet, but my metal looks much better. The next part is, because I am making this into a brooch, I would like to attach a pin back. And I have 2 pieces of metal, again, that I'm going to rivet together like that. So I've drilled some holes in the 2 pieces of metal already for my rivets, but I am able to rivet the pin with 1 rivet in the middle. And this is just part of my design. I just wanted to show you another way that you could make a very interesting bezel set cabochon design. You don't necessarily have to make it jewelry if you don't want to, but This is another way to expand on your skills and to use what you've learned in different demonstrations and throughout this class. So I am riveting on this pin back with just one rivet. If you wanted to add more rivets for extra security, you could, but because I already have 2 more rivets going on the front of this for my brass piece, I just decided on one. And that rivet will be, again, covered up by that brass piece according to my design, so I won't see it. Now I'm going to use the flex shaft to clean up the excess solder. So it is best practice, even though you are putting a stone on top of it, to clean up that solder. It is more professional. So solder within the seam is perfectly fine, but anything that's spilling out over the edge or is in a place where it shouldn't be is not considered something in the industry standard. So I'm using different grinding tips in my flex shaft to clean the inside of the bezel first and then the outside. It's also important to clean the inside of the bezel because if there are lumps in your solder, it is possible that your stone won't sit flat. So just grinding that excess solder away is not only more professional looking, but it is essential for making sure that your stone sits how you want it to sit. The texture on the inside of the bezel, because I have a solid stone, is not something I need to worry about or polish or sand, but just cleaning it up with some of these grinding bits and burrs will help it. So after I've done the inside, I'm going to take a smaller bit and do the outside seam and just clean that up a little bit more. Now remember that the flex shaft does leave a little bit of texture, so if it's something where it's scratching up your metal and it's not part of your design, you need to be conscious of what bit or burr you are using to clean this up. So I'm trying to keep as close to the edge as possible. And my bezel is brass and my back piece is brass, so the solder is very visible because obviously it's not yellow like the brass. Alright, the next thing is I'm going to make sure that my bezel doesn't have any solder on it. So I'm going to switch the bit or the burr one more time. You don't need to use this as many bits and burrs as I am, but I just want to make sure that, again, all that solder is cleaned up. I'm going over the seam as well, just making sure that that seam didn't come apart. Now my solder's all cleaned up. Alright, sometimes you can file a little bit more if you feel like there's some solder that still didn't come off, but I like to use the flex shaft because it's pretty fast and you have more. Alright, so now I'm going to make the nameplate that's going to go on the bottom and hang with jump rings. So I've drilled some holes. And for this, I'm going to add some texture using a hammer. So I'm using the rounded part of the ball peen hammer on a steel block. I'm just hitting it to give it some of that really cool sort of scaly-like texture. So again, this is just another way to add texture to your piece. It is not something that's required for this particular project. But just another way to expand your skills and to use what you've learned in this class to make a more unique and complex design. So this nameplate is going to have holes drilled in it for the jump rings to hang, but it's also going to have letter stamps because I wanted to add a quote to my brooch. So I'm just measuring it again, making sure that the holes that I have drilled in my brooch itself match up with the holes that I will be drilling in the nameplate. So after I've done that, I like to measure where the text is going to go. So you can look at the letter and number stamps video as well. But for this, I have 2 words that I'm concentrating on, and I want to make sure that they line up evenly with my design. So I'm using Sharpie because it's temporary, and then I'm also sort of boxing in the first word and then the second word, just so I give myself a good base. Now remember, this can be sanded off, so it's not, again, permanent. So if you need a reminder about letter stamps, go back to the YouTube video, but for now, I'm just zooming through this to show you one part of my brooch design. Think about how you can make your bezel set cabochon design very unique to you. Is it jewelry? Is it a sculpture? Is it functional? How does it engage space? So in this case, this word plate is hanging off of it and it's constantly moving if I were to wear it. So that is engaging space. And it has lots of texture. So now I'm going to go sand off that Sharpie just to see what it looks like with my quote. and I like it. It's good. Okay, now I'm ready to assemble now that I have all my pieces completed. I also decided to drill more holes in my bottom word plate. Now I need to rivet my top two pieces together, and this is a little tricky only because I have a pin back on it. But I'm going to use pre-made copper rivets. I've drilled 18 gauge holes for this. And again, if you need a reminder about rivets, there is an entire video on cold connections for you. So we've done a hot connection again with the bezel, and now a cold connection. So this is obviously exceeding expectations. This would be considered a 4 project. So I'm just assembling my piece, making sure my rivets line up, cutting them, filing them, and then hammering them down. Being conscious not to hit my bezel on the way, and going off the edge of the block so I don't mess up my pin back. So you will need to be a little creative about how you solve these problems, but there is my brooch. So now we will need to add our stone. So you want to make sure that your bezel is not bent and it's open. And I used a pliers to open that up. And then I push my stone down as far as it will go, making sure that it's nice and flat up against that back piece of metal. Sometimes if it gets stuck or you need to move it, you can use an X-Acto knife or some sort of sharp tool. But you always want to be sure that you're not scratching up your stone in the process. You need to make sure that we're keeping that safe. You're now going to find a toolbox that says Bezel Set Stone Supplies. And there are 3 different tools that you can use to set your stone. I have my favorites, and the first one is a pusher, which is a flat piece of steel that looks kind of like a square at the end. And I push in the sides of the bezel from opposite sides. So if I go on the right, then I'm going to go immediately on the left. And what that does is it keeps the stone nice and even in your bezel. So I'm rotating around my metal piece, pushing in little pieces at a time. Your bezel is a little bit thicker and harder to manipulate, so you're going to use a lot of force and muscle, but you want to be careful not to break your stone and not to scratch your stone. So I put my thumb sort of in the way and I hold my stone down. Some people like to tape their metal down onto a surface, but because I have a pin back, it'll be a little bit weird for me to do that. So I'm trying to get all the wrinkles out of my bezel and press all the open or empty spaces tight up against that stone. You don't want your stone to slip out, but it is possible to tighten it too far. The next is the rocker. It is like a semicircle shape or a half moon shape. And what that does is it rocks up against the bezel as you press it to get some of those wrinkles out. It's not my favorite tool, but it is a tool that will help you if you have lots of wrinkles and if your bezel is a little bit thinner. My favorite tool is the burnisher, and the burnisher goes along the edge of the bezel to thin that out up against the stone. Now when you use the burnisher, you almost want to think about whittling, and you're going to use the side of the burnisher to push up that thin part that's closest to the top of your stone. This is a possibility of scratching your stone using the burnisher, so just be careful and conscious as you are using it. So now my stone is stuck, it's not coming out, my bezel is nice and flat, and I have polished it to mirror shine, and it is all finished. When you're polishing, you want to be careful not to polish all over your stone and not to scratch it up. But I've assembled my brooch, I put my jump rings into my nameplate, everything is nice and even. I've wiped off all of the polish, and it is a functional finished design. So good luck with your Cabochon bezel set stone, and I hope you make some really cool and creative things.